At its peak, the Roman gladiatorial system employed tens of thousands of fighters across an empire that stretched from Britain to Syria. The Colosseum alone could seat 50,000 spectators and drain a man's blood in under 3 minutes. But here's the part the movies never tell you. The most powerful person in that arena wasn't the emperor with his famous thumb. It wasn't the roaring crowd. It was a man with a ledger and a very firm opinion about return on investment. Because a trained gladiator cost roughly the same as a luxury house. And nobody, not even Rome, liked setting luxury houses on fire for fun. Tonight, we're stepping into the arena, down into the tunnels beneath it, and inside a helmet that will steal everything but the sound of your own terrified breathing. The Hollywood version got the survival rate exactly backwards. Most gladiators survived most fights. The real question was never whether you'd die in the sand. It was whether you could survive everything else. Settle in. Get comfortable. You're going to need it. You know the scene. You've seen it 100 times. The fallen gladiator lies in the sand, chest heaving, blood smeared across his face. The emperor leans forward. The crowd screams. A thumb turns. Death or mercy in a single gesture. It's iconic. It's dramatic. And it's almost entirely wrong. The real person deciding whether you lived or died wasn't sitting in the imperial box. He was sitting in the stands with a wax tablet doing arithmetic. His name was the Lanista, the owner of the gladiator school, and he had spent the equivalent of a luxury sports car on your purchase, your training, your medical care, and your very specific diet. Every time you stepped onto that sand, his investment stepped with you. And the Lanista did not enjoy watching his investments bleed out for the entertainment of people who hadn't paid nearly enough for the privilege. Here's the number that changes everything. If you died in a bout, the sponsor of the games owed your owner up to 50 times your rental fee. 50 times. Suddenly, that dramatic thumbs down looks less like imperial power and more like a financial catastrophe nobody wanted to authorize. So most gladiators survived most fights. Not because Rome was merciful, because Rome was economical. The real question, the one the movies never bother with, isn't whether you'd survive the arena. It's whether you could survive the life. The years of training that broke your body in quiet, unglamorous ways. The diet that turned you into something unrecognizable. The fame that followed you like a shadow and meant absolutely nothing when the cell door locked behind you at night. You've just been sold to a ludus in Capua. Your old life, whatever it was, is over. Let's find out what the new one looks like. The first thing you notice about the ludus is that it smells like effort and regret. A thick, layered stench, sweat baked into stone over years, animal fat rubbed into skin as a crude moisturizer, and beneath it all, the iron tang of old blood from the practice yard that no amount of sand can fully absorb. The compound is built around a central courtyard, open to the sky but surrounded on all sides by high stone walls topped with inward-leaning spikes. Think of it as a very hostile university campus. The courtyard is where you'll train. The corridors branching off it lead to cells barely large enough for a man to lie down with his arms at his sides. Your bed is a stone shelf. Your blanket is optional and smells like the last 3 men who used it. You are not alone. The ludus holds dozens of men, and their origins are a strange cocktail of Roman misfortune. slaves purchased specifically for the arena. Condemned criminals offered a fighting chance instead of outright execution. And then there are the octorati, free men who volunteered. They signed contracts surrendering their legal autonomy, their right to refuse orders, and in some cases their bodily integrity, all for a signing bonus and the distant, glittering promise of fame. They chose this, which, depending on your perspective, either makes them brave or profoundly bad at risk assessment. The lanista walks the line of new arrivals like a man inspecting horses at market. He tilts your jaw, squeezes your shoulder. A medicus, the school physician, checks your teeth, your joints, your breathing. You are being appraised not as a person, but as a piece of equipment with a projected service life. You're assigned a cell, a number, a classification that someone else chose for you based on your height, your build, your apparent capacity to absorb punishment without becoming unprofitable. The gate closes behind you. The lock is on the outside. Even the volunteers heard that click. Even they flinched. Welcome to your new career. The hours are terrible. The benefits are worse. And the retirement plan is, optimistically, theoretical. Let's talk about your diet because it's going to disappoint you in ways you didn't think a meal could. You are not eating red meat. You are not eating like a warrior from a movie poster. You are eating barley. Enormous, soul-crushing quantities of barley porridge, supplemented with beans, boiled grain, dried fruit, and oatmeal that could generously be described as food adjacent. Your caloric intake is massive. Your enjoyment of it is not. And then there's the drink. A vinegar solution mixed with bone ash from burned plants. It tastes exactly like you'd expect a beverage made from fire, residue, and sour wine to taste. But it's loaded with calcium, and the lanista doesn't care about your palate. He cares about your bone density. Here's the part that would break every modern fitness influencer's heart. You are being deliberately fattened. Not muscular. Not lean. Fat. The goal is to build a thick layer of subcutaneous fat over your muscles, particularly across your torso and arms. This fat serves as biological armor. When a blade slashes across your ribs, it cuts through fat first, producing a spectacular spray of blood that sends the crowd into ecstasy, while the muscle and organs underneath remain functional. You bleed beautifully. You keep fighting. You are, in the most literal sense, being engineered to be wounded without being destroyed. The Romans had a word for gladiators like you. Hordearii. Barley men. It was a taunt. The well-fed belly, the soft-looking body, it didn't match the heroic ideal. People mocked you for it. But the mockery missed the point entirely. That belly was the reason you'd survive a sword cut that would kill a leaner man. Every spoonful of porridge you choked down was another millimeter of protection between a crowd-pleasing wound and a career-ending one. You don't look like a movie gladiator. You look like someone who could survive being one. That's the trade, and nobody asked your opinion on it. Fight day arrives, and you learn something important about fear. The worst part is never the thing itself. It's the waiting. You're led through corridors that descend beneath the arena floor into the hypogeum, an underground labyrinth of tunnels, holding cells, mechanical lifts, and animal pens. The ceiling is low. The stone is damp in a way that suggests it has never been dry and never intends to be. Torchlight licks the walls in unsteady orange, throwing shadows that move when nothing else does. The smell arrives before the sound. Animal enclosures line the far tunnels, lions, bears, imported exotics that the crowd will watch die in the morning beast hunts. The stench is dense and biological, fur waste, and the sour musk of creatures that know, on some animal level, that this place is wrong. Layered over it is the human contribution. Sweat, vomit, the acrid sharpness of fear working its way out through pores. You sit in a holding area with other gladiators. Some pray to gods you don't recognize. Some sit perfectly still, eyes focused on a point in the middle distance that doesn't exist. One man in the corner has been vomiting quietly and methodically for the last 20 minutes. Nobody comments. This is apparently normal. Above you, the crowd is already roaring. The sound travels through the stone and arrives not as individual voices, but as a single tidal presence. A vibration in your sternum. A pressure in your ears. You can hear the morning program playing out overhead. The bestiary hunts, the animal fights, and between them, something worse. The lunchtime executions of the Noxi, condemned criminals dragged into the arena and killed without ceremony. The crowd barely watches. They use the break to buy food. Somewhere above, an attendant is raking the sand smooth for your bout. The arena surface is mixed with sawdust, packed in specifically to absorb blood without becoming slippery. You learned this in training, a practical detail delivered with the same casual tone as instructions for maintaining your equipment. Now, sitting beneath that sand, you can hear the rake. A slow, rhythmic scraping. Someone is smoothing out whatever happened in the last fight so the surface is clean for yours. That sound, the gentle, patient rake, is somehow the worst thing you've heard all day. The fight starts, and the first thing you notice is that there's a referee. The Summa Rudi stands between you and the retiarius, a senior official carrying a long wooden staff. He's not decorative. He can step in, pause the action, separate the fighters, and enforce rules that the crowd doesn't always appreciate, but the financial backers absolutely insist on. This is a regulated event, not a brawl. There are illegal strikes, illegal holds, and if the Summa Rudis decides the fight has become too dangerous to continue, he ends it. Period. The movies skip this part. It's not dramatic enough. Your retiarius circles. You turn, trying to track him through the miserable coin-sized windows in your helmet. He throws the net. You feel the weighted edge catch your shoulder guard, and for one airless second, the ropes tighten before you wrench free. The crowd responds, not with bloodlust exactly, but with something closer to the sound of a stadium watching a spectacular play. They're entertained. You're trying not to die. Same event, very different experiences. Your training takes over. You close distance because that's what secutors do. Get inside the trident's reach where the long weapon becomes a liability. He jabs. You deflect. You swing. The gladius connects across his hip and the crowd erupts. Here's what the blade does. It cuts through the subcutaneous fat layer exactly as your diet intended. Blood pours. It looks devastating from the stands. The reality is a flesh wound that stings like fury, but leaves the muscle intact. He's still moving. You're still moving. The fight continues. 10 minutes in, your arms feel like they're filled with wet sand. Your lungs burn inside the helmet. The adrenaline that carried you through the first exchange has curdled into plain exhaustion. Real gladiatorial combat is a cardio nightmare. Short, explosive bursts of violence separated by circling, gasping recovery that the crowd reads as tension and you experience as slow suffocation. The retiarius catches your leg with the trident's edge. You stumble. He presses. You take a shallow cut across the forearm, and the blood runs warm down your wrist and drips off your knuckles into the sand. You raise a finger. One finger extended upward. Ad digitum. The universal signal of submission. The Summa Rudis steps in. The crowd screams opinions. But the decision belongs to the editor, the wealthy sponsor who paid for these games, and the editor is doing exactly the same math the Lanista taught you to expect. If he sentences you to death, he owes your owner 50 times your rental fee. Your death would bankrupt the afternoon's entertainment budget and probably the next 3 shows after it. He turns to the crowd. He lets them roar. He makes the gesture that tells everyone you're spared. You didn't win, but you survived. And in the accounting that actually mattered, that was always the most profitable outcome. After the fight, the medicus works on you with the focused disinterest of a man who has stitched 1,000 cuts and finds yours unremarkable. Roman gladiatorial medicine was, by the standards of the ancient world, genuinely impressive. Not because it was comfortable, but because gladiators were too expensive to lose to infection if a bit of effort could prevent it. Galen, one of the most important physicians in the history of medicine, built his early career stitching up gladiators in Pergamon. He learned anatomy not from textbooks, but from the open bodies of men who needed to be functional again by next month. Gladiators were, in a grim sense, the best anatomical education available. Your cuts are cleaned with vinegar, because it stings in a way that suggests it might be working. Honey is packed into the deeper wounds as a poultice, a treatment that modern science has retroactively validated as genuinely antibacterial. Your ribs are wrapped. A dislocated finger is reset with a sharp pull and no warning. There is no anesthesia. There is no germ theory. There is a man with steady hands and a financial incentive to keep you breathing. The cuts heal. They heal into scars that layer over the scars from training, which layered over the scars from your first weeks in the ludus. Your body is becoming a topographic map of every fight, every drill, every time the doctors decided your form needed correcting with a stick. Older gladiators in the compound walk with limps they no longer notice. They squint from head injuries that never fully resolved. They can't raise their arms above their shoulders because something in the joint gave out 2 years ago and the medicus did his best, which wasn't enough. You start to understand the shape of what's actually happening. You're not going to die in one glorious cinematic moment. You're going to be maintained, patched, repaired, and sent back out, accumulating damage in a body that doesn't belong to you for as long as that body remains profitable. The horror isn't the sword. It's the needle and thread that come after. Let's be honest here, because the cozy version of this story has limits, and the dead deserve accuracy. Not every gladiator walked out of the arena. Depending on the era, somewhere between 1 in 5 and 1 in 10 bouts ended in death. The economics made survival the norm, but the norm is not a guarantee, and the gap between those two words was filled with men who didn't come back. Some drew unlucky matchups paired against a far superior opponent in a bout designed to showcase the favorite. Some fought during politically charged games where the editor needed to demonstrate generosity to a restless crowd, and generosity, in Roman terms, occasionally meant giving the people the death they demanded. Some simply caught a blade at the wrong angle, a trident point that slipped past the fat layer and found something vital. And then there were the Noxi, condemned criminals sentenced to die in the arena, not as gladiators but as executions dressed in spectacle. They fought during the lunch break, often against each other or against animals, with no training, no armor, and no possibility of survival. The crowd mostly didn't watch. They bought sausages and used the interval to find their seats. The Noxi died to the sound of casual conversation and chewing. The Colosseum employed attendants dressed as Charon and Mercury, gods of death and passage. When a gladiator fell, the Charon figure approached and pressed a hot iron to the body. If you flinched, you weren't dead. There was no faking it. No playing possum. The system had a quality control check, and it involved burning metal. The Mercury figure then escorted the dead through the Porta Libetnensis, the gate of death, and into the processing area behind the arena where the body was handled with the administrative efficiency realm applied to everything. Survival was the business model. But death was always in the room, sitting quietly in the corner, waiting for the math to change. There is a way out. It's real. It's documented. And for most gladiators, it's a beautiful story that happens to someone else. The rudis. A wooden training sword, the same kind you've been drilling with since your first day in the ludus, presented to you in the arena as a symbol of retirement and freedom. The crowd cheers. The lanista releases your contract. You walk out of the Porta Santa Viveria, the gate of the living, as a free man. It happened. We have records. But the conditions required to earn it were steep. You needed to survive long enough, fight well enough, and become famous enough that your retirement was itself a spectacle worth staging. The lanista had to agree, because releasing you meant losing an asset. The editor had to approve, because the ceremony needed an audience that cared. It had to be a name, not a number. Volunteer gladiators served contracts of 3 to 5 years. Enslaved gladiators served indefinitely, or until someone with authority decided they'd earned enough. Many didn't survive the full term, not always from the arena, but from the accumulated weight of chronic injuries, infections that the medicus couldn't outrun, or the simple physical collapse of a body subjected to years of regulated violence. And those who did earn the rudis, they walked out into a world that had no place for them. No transferable skills, unless someone needed a man who was excellent at being hit. No savings, if they'd entered as slaves. A body held together by scar tissue and stubbornness. Some became trainers at the schools that had owned them. Some became bodyguards for wealthy Romans who liked the prestige. And some, a number that the sources mention without commentary, walked back into the ludus voluntarily. Because the arena, for all its horrors, was the only structure their life had ever known. The Rudes was hope. And hope, in the gladiatorial system, worked exactly like the barley diet. It kept you going. That was its function. So, could you survive as a Roman gladiator? Statistically, probably. The economics were on your side. The Lanista wanted you alive. The editor wanted his budget intact. The medicus wanted to maintain his track record. The whole system was engineered to keep you just healthy enough to bleed again next month. But survival is a low bar, and the question was never really about the arena. Could you survive the barley diet that turned your body into something you didn't recognize? The stone cell that locked from the outside, even if you volunteered to be there? The training that cracked your ribs in the name of making you crack someone else's? The helmet that stole your sight and filled your ears with nothing but your own panicked breathing? The hypogeum where you sat in animal stench and torchlight, listening to the rake smooth out the last man's blood? The fame that followed you everywhere and freed you from nothing? The gladiator myth is one of history's great misunderstandings. Not a death sentence, but something arguably harder to make a movie about. A career of controlled suffering, carefully maintained just below the threshold of permanent destruction, because your pain was profitable and your recovery was an investment. We still do this, by the way. We just use different arenas, different contracts, different barley. Professional athletes with shattered joints and traumatic brain injuries, maintained and celebrated and used until the math stops working, then released into a world that loved the spectacle, but has limited interest in the aftermath. The movies got the thumbs down wrong. The real verdict was never about one dramatic moment of imperial mercy. It was about the books balancing. It was always about the books balancing. And somewhere in the stands, a man with a wax tablet nods. The numbers look fine. Send in the next one. Somewhere beneath a narrow street in a European city, around the year 1400, a set of stone steps descends into a kind of room that the neighbors cannot quite explain. They know it exists. They can smell it. A faint, rotten egg bitterness that seeps up through the floorboards and drifts across the alley like a rumor no one wants to confirm. Sulfur. Or maybe something worse. The kind of smell that clings to wool and makes dogs sneeze and gives the local priest just enough reason to pause, frown, and keep walking. Down those steps, the air changes. It thickens. The temperature rises by 10 degrees before the bottom stair, and by the time the basement opens into the workshop proper, the warmth has become a presence, something alive and faintly hostile. The source sits in the center of the room like a squat clay altar, the Athener, the sustained heat furnace, the beating heart of every alchemist's operation. It has been burning for 3 days straight, fed by a teenage apprentice who sleeps curled on a straw mat beside it, waking every few hours to add charcoal and check the temperature by holding his hand near the vent. He does not own a thermometer. Nobody does. His palm is the instrument. The walls are damp stone lined with wooden shelves, and on those shelves sit rows of jars that would make a modern chemist quietly leave the room. Unlabeled. Sealed with wax and cloth. Some contain mercury, liquid, and silver bright. Some hold sulfur in powdered yellow heaps. Others store compounds that do not yet have proper names, only descriptions written in a private shorthand that looks, to anyone outside this room, like the ravings of a man who dreams in symbols. Diagrams are pinned to the walls with iron nails, curling at the edges from the damp. They depict lions devouring suns, eagles swallowing serpents, a king and queen dissolving into a shared bath of gold. To any passing city official, this looks exactly like a sorcerer's den, which is precisely the problem. Because the man who works here, the one currently decanting a pale liquid through a clay funnel into a glass alembic with the careful precision of a surgeon, is not a sorcerer. He is not a mystic. He is not a madman, despite what the smell might suggest. He is something far more dangerous to the medieval economy. He is an unregulated craftsman with proprietary knowledge and no legal framework to protect it. There are no patents in 1400, no intellectual property courts, no non-disclosure agreements. If a rival workshop discovers that this man has perfected a technique for producing vermilion pigment, a red so vivid it makes cathedral manuscripts glow like embers, that rival can simply steal the recipe, or buy off the apprentice, or, in more creative cases, accuse the alchemist of heresy and let the church sort out the competition. So the door is locked. The windows, if they exist, are shuttered. The notes are written in code. And the apprentice has been made to understand, in terms both firm and mildly threatening, that the contents of this basement stay in this basement. This is not a wizard's tower. It is a startup in a cellar running on charcoal and paranoia, producing real products for real clients, and operating under the constant, exhausting awareness that the line between tolerated craftsman and accused witch is exactly as thick as the local bishop's patience. The furnace hums. The alembic drips. The fumes rise slowly toward the street above, where the neighbors wrinkle their noses and decide, once again, not to ask. Now, here is where the popular story goes sideways. Because when most people hear the word alchemy, they picture a wild-eyed man in a pointed hat trying to turn lead into gold. And yes, that narrative existed. It was the dream. The brand. The thing that made wealthy patrons open their coin purses and say, "Go on then, impress me." But it was not the daily business. The daily business was pigments, medicines, acids, alloys, perfumes, cosmetics, things the medieval world desperately needed and would pay handsomely for. The alchemist's workshop was, in practice, a combination pharmaceutical lab, chemical supply house, and luxury goods manufacturer, all crammed into a room the size of a modern studio apartment with none of the ventilation. Consider vermilion. A pigment produced by heating mercury and sulfur together until they fused into mercuric sulfide, then grinding the result into a powder so intensely, impossibly red that it could make a painted page look like it was bleeding light. Vermilion was worth more than gold by weight in certain markets. It made manuscripts luminous. It made altar panels divine. And the alchemist who could produce it consistently, without poisoning himself to death in the process, something we will return to shortly, had a product more valuable than any mythical philosopher's stone. Or consider aqua regia, a mixture of nitric and hydrochloric acid capable of dissolving gold itself, not transmuting lead into gold, dissolving actual gold. That was a real thing alchemists could do, and it was terrifyingly useful for assaying, purification, and metallurgical work. Distilled herbal tinctures served as medicines. Mineral compounds treated skin conditions. Stronger alloys meant better tools, better weapons, better church bells. The products were tangible, functional, and commercially necessary. And the Philosopher's Stone? That was the venture capital pitch. The aspirational moonshot that kept noble patrons writing checks while the real work, the profitable work, happened on the bench. Every alchemist knew the gold dream was the reason the funding existed. The acids and pigments were the reason the workshop survived. It was a business model that any modern tech founder would recognize instantly. Promise the impossible. Deliver the useful. Keep the investors excited while the actual product ships quietly out the back door. Symbols were born, not from fantasy, but from observation. The first stage was negrito, blackening. The raw material decomposed, darkened, and reduced to a charred mass. To a modern chemist, this is thermal decomposition. To a medieval observer watching it through the murky glass of a sealed flask, it looked like death itself. The substance had died. Then came albedo, whitening. As the process continued and temperature shifted, lighter compounds separated and rose. A pale residue formed. Purification. Resurrection, if one were inclined toward metaphor, and alchemists were always inclined toward metaphor. The work itself was not glamorous. It was slow, hot, physically punishing, and smelled like the inside of a volcano's digestive system. A typical distillation cycle could last days, sometimes weeks. The alchemist would load raw materials into a vessel, seal it with a paste called lute, a clay and horsehair mixture that cracked if applied poorly and exploded if applied very poorly, and then place it over the athenor at a carefully maintained temperature. Then the waiting began. During these long cycles, the material inside the vessel changed. And here is where alchemy's most famous citrinitas followed. Yellowing, a transitional stage where the material warmed in color, suggesting the approach of something valuable. And finally, rubedo, reddening. The completed transformation, the emergence of the desired product in its most concentrated, most vivid form. Black, white, yellow, red. 4 stages, 4 colors, 4 perfectly accurate descriptions of what actually happens when you heat certain compounds through sustained temperature cycles. It was empirical observation, dressed in allegory because allegory was the only formal language these practitioners had. Chemistry as a discipline did not exist yet, so they described what they saw using the tools available: mythology, symbolism, and dragons. Lots of dragons. The apprentice, meanwhile, lived inside this process like a cog in a breathing machine. His job was fire. Constant, unwavering, precisely calibrated fire. Too cool, and the reaction stalled. Too hot, and the vessel cracked, releasing whatever toxic vapor had been building inside it directly into a room with no windows. The apprentice slept in shifts, fed the furnace in shifts, and breathed in whatever the furnace decided to share. He was part lab technician, part bellows operator, part human sacrifice to the cause of experimental consistency. And then, every few months, a patron would visit. This was the performance. The alchemist would prepare a demonstration, a carefully staged reaction designed to impress. Perhaps the synthesis of aqua regia, mixing fuming acids together until the liquid turned golden orange and dissolved a sliver of actual gold in real time. Perhaps a mercury sublimation, heating liquid mercury until it rose as vapor and condensed on a cold surface as a crystalline solid, appearing to transform from water into frost before the patron's eyes. These demonstrations were investor pitches. Medieval startup demos held in a basement that smelled like the underworld, complete with dramatic lighting provided by the furnace, sound effects provided by the bubbling Olympics, and a showman in a singed apron explaining, with great confidence, that the final breakthrough was very, very close. The patron would nod. The patron would be amazed. The patron would extend the funding for another season. And the alchemist would return to the bench, knowing full well that the philosopher's stone was not coming. But the vermilion order was due by Thursday, and the acid shipment needed to be ready by the end of the month, and the apprentice had fallen asleep again, and the furnace temperature was dropping. The wonder was real. The chemistry was real. The theater was just how the bills got paid. Now let us talk about what the workshop did to the people inside it. Because the answer is nothing good. Nothing good at all. Mercury was everywhere. It was the most important, most versatile, most used substance in the alchemical toolkit, and it was also, to put it in modern terms, a catastrophic neurotoxin that accumulated in the body with every single exposure. The alchemist did not know this. He knew mercury vapor made him feel strange. He knew his hands sometimes trembled after long sessions over the heating vessel. He knew that his mood had changed over the years, that he startled more easily, that sleep came harder, that his temper flared at things that once would not have bothered him. What he was experiencing has a clinical name now, erethism. Mercury-induced psychological deterioration. Symptoms include irritability, anxiety, depression, social withdrawal, memory loss, insomnia, and a creeping, unshakable paranoia that makes the sufferer feel watched, threatened, hunted. In an occupation already defined by secrecy and competitive anxiety, mercury poisoning did not create paranoia so much as pour fuel on an existing fire. The alchemist grew suspicious, fearful, erratic. And everyone around him simply assumed this was what happened to people who spent too long staring into flasks and muttering about dragons. The physical symptoms were worse. Tremors that made fine work increasingly impossible. Drooling. Tooth loss as mercury attacked the gums and jaw. Kidney damage. Eventual cognitive collapse. The alchemist's body became, over years, a slow-motion record of everything he had ever heated, distilled, or breathed. And mercury was only the headliner. Lead was a constant companion in metallurgical work, smelting, and pigment production. Chronic lead exposure brought fatigue, abdominal pain, joint aches, confusion, and eventually brain damage. Arsenic appeared in pigment production and certain mineral preparations, bringing its own signature gifts: skin lesions, peripheral nerve damage, a gradual wasting that killed in increments so small the victim barely noticed until the damage was done. Sulfur fumes scarred the lungs. Acid vapors blistered the throat and sinuses. The apprentice bore the worst of it. Always the youngest person in the room, always the one closest to the furnace, always the one tasked with grinding the mercury or stirring the sulfur or tending the vessel that had been sealed for 3 days and might, upon opening, release a concentrated cloud of something that no human lung was designed to handle. The apprentice was expendable in the way that only the young and powerless can be expendable, a warm body fed into the machine of knowledge production with the understanding that some percentage of warm bodies simply did not come out the other side. The supreme cruelty of it all, the irony so bitter it could etch glass, is that many of these alchemists spent their careers searching for the elixir of life, the universal medicine, the substance that would cure all disease and extend human life indefinitely. They searched for immortality while standing in a cloud of mercury vapor, with lead in their blood and arsenic under their fingernails, shortening their lives with every breath they took in service of the dream. And the dangers were not only chemical. Rival workshops operated in the same cities, often in the same neighborhoods, and competition was vicious. Recipe theft was common. Apprentice poaching was a constant threat. And when subtler methods failed, there was always the nuclear option, an accusation. A whisper to the church that a competitor's work was not craft but sorcery. Not chemistry but heresy. In a world where the boundary between tolerated experimentalism and prosecutable witchcraft was drawn by people who had no understanding of either, an accusation was a weapon more devastating than any acid. Alchemists lived in a triple bind. Their secrecy was necessary for economic survival, but that same secrecy made them look guilty to civic and religious authorities. Their materials were toxic, but abandoning them meant abandoning their livelihood. Their patrons demanded results, but one failed demonstration could end a funding relationship permanently, leaving the alchemist with a basement full of expensive chemicals and no income. The psychological toll was staggering even before the mercury got involved. Isolation, paranoia, financial precarity. The constant awareness that the locked door that protected trade secrets also, if circumstances shifted, looked exactly like the locked door of someone with something sinister to hide. Many alchemists died young. Many died confused. Many died alone in the very workshops that had consumed their health, their sanity, and their years. The furnace that kept their livelihood alive was, in a very real sense, the thing that killed them. But they kept going, because the work was extraordinary, and someone had to do it, and the vermilion was not going to synthesize itself. So what exactly were the patrons buying? Not gold. Not usually. The savvy ones knew better. What they were purchasing was exclusivity, a proprietary formula for a pigment that no other workshop in the region could produce, a metallurgical technique that yielded stronger alloys for weapons or tools, a medicine, dubious or otherwise, that no competing court physician could replicate. Knowledge was the product, and secrecy was the packaging. A prince who controlled a superior steel alloy controlled better swords, and better swords controlled better outcomes in the sort of diplomatic negotiations that involved large numbers of armed men. A merchant guild that held a monopoly on a particular dye formula controlled a luxury trade worth more than land. The alchemist was the engine of these advantages, and the mystification surrounding the work was not an accident. It was a pricing strategy. The more arcane the process appeared, the more irreplaceable the alchemist seemed, and the higher the fee he could command. There was emotional labor involved too, naturally. The alchemist served as a kind of intellectual pet for wealthy households. Part advisor, part entertainer, part status symbol. Having your own alchemist was a flex, the medieval equivalent of having a private research division, and it communicated sophistication, ambition, and the kind of disposable income that made rivals nervous. The alchemist understood this dynamic perfectly. He was selling wonder as much as product. And wonder, properly managed, never went out of style. Open an alchemical manuscript from the 14th or 15th century, and the first thing that strikes is the sheer beauty of it. Vivid illustrations of lions biting the sun. Kings and queens dissolving into mercury baths. Eagles devouring serpents while standing on mountaintops that drip with golden rain. It looks like mythology. It looks like madness. It looks, in the most generous reading, like the fever dream of someone who spent too many nights breathing sulfur. It is none of those things. It is a recipe book. The system was called decknamen, literally cover names. Every common chemical substance was assigned a mythological identity. The green lion was vitriol, which is to say sulfuric acid. The red king was gold. The white queen was mercury. The devouring wolf was antimony. These were not metaphors chosen at random. They were a deliberately constructed code designed to make the alchemist's most valuable intellectual property unreadable to anyone outside the tradition. Consider a recipe for synthesizing nitric acid. In plain language, it might read, heat saltpeter with vitriol in a sealed retort and collect the distillate. Clear, simple, reproducible. Also easily stolen by any literate person who happened to see the page. Now write the same recipe in alchemical code. The green lion devours the fiery salt, and from its belly rises the spirit of nitre, sharp as the eagle's cry, which must be caught in a vessel of perfect seal lest it escape to wound the air. That reads like poetry. It reads like allegory. It reads like the kind of thing that makes a modern reader dismiss alchemy as pre-scientific nonsense. But to a trained alchemist, it was as precise and actionable as a modern chemical equation. The great manuscripts encoded entire libraries of practical knowledge this way. The Rosarium Philosophorum, published in the early 16th century, contained sequences of illustrated allegories that depicted chemical processes in narrative form. The Splendor Solis, one of the most beautiful manuscripts in the Western tradition, wrapped metallurgical techniques in paintings so gorgeous they were collected as art, which was another form of protection, because no one suspects a painting of being an industrial secret. The Mutus Liber, the silent book, went further still and communicated its recipes entirely through images, no words at all, requiring the reader to already understand the visual vocabulary before a single instruction could be extracted. It was encryption. Gorgeous, hand-painted, gold-leafed encryption. And it worked. It worked so well, in fact, that it fooled everyone who came after. Centuries of historians looked at these manuscripts and saw mysticism. They saw failed philosophy. They saw deluded dreamers chasing impossible transformations. What they did not see, because the code was that good, was a body of empirical knowledge so carefully guarded that its own security system erased it from the historical record. The modern equivalent is not hard to find. Pharmaceutical companies guard formulas behind patents written in language so dense and technical that they function as a kind of legal code, readable only by specialists. Trade secret law protects proprietary processes with contractual walls that serve the same purpose as the alchemist's locked door. Non-disclosure agreements bind employees to silence with the same fervor that a master alchemist demanded of his apprentice. The impulse is identical. Only the aesthetic has changed. We traded dragons for lawyers. It is not entirely clear that this was an upgrade. The hidden world began to crack in the 1450s, and the force that cracked it was not the church, not a royal decree, not a rival workshop sabotage. It was paper. Movable type. A printing press in Mainz operated by a man named Gutenberg, who probably never thought about alchemy at all, but who destroyed its foundational logic simply by making books cheap. The entire security architecture of the alchemical tradition depended on scarcity. Manuscripts were handwritten. Copies were rare, expensive, and controlled. A coded recipe could circulate among a small network of trusted practitioners and remain secret for generations. But once a text could be printed in hundreds of copies and distributed across Europe in months, the code stopped working. Not because it was broken, but because exposure increased the odds of someone, somewhere, figuring it out. The Green Lion could hide among 3 handwritten copies. It could not hide among 300 printed ones. Alchemical texts flooded the market in the 16th century. Some were genuine workshop manuals, stripped of their code by printers who understood the commercial value of demystification. Some were fraudulent, cobbled together by opportunists who knew the symbols but not the chemistry. And some were hybrids, real techniques wrapped in just enough mystical language to maintain the aura of secret knowledge while being functionally readable by anyone with patience. The tradition did not die overnight. It fragmented. Serious practitioners continued their work but found themselves increasingly lumped in with charlatans by a public that could now read about alchemy without understanding it. The coded language that had once protected real knowledge now made all alchemists look equally suspicious. And then, slowly, a new framework arrived. In 1661, Robert Boyle published The Sceptical Chymist, arguing that chemical substances should be understood through experiment and observation rather than Aristotelian theory. He did not invent this approach. Alchemists had been practicing it for centuries in their basements. But Boyle gave it a formal structure, a public language, and crucially, a new name: chemistry. Clean, respectable, institutional chemistry with published methods and reproducible results, and absolutely no dragons anywhere. A century later, Antoine Lavoisier would finish the job, establishing the system of chemical nomenclature that replaced the decknamen entirely. Oxygen instead of the red serpent's breath. Sulfuric acid instead of the green lion. Clear, universal, unencrypted. The secrecy was over. And here is the irony that tastes like sulfur and smells like vindication. Alchemy died because it succeeded. Its techniques became the foundation of modern chemistry. Its products became the foundation of the pharmaceutical and industrial chemical industries. Its obsession with proprietary secrecy became patent law, trade secret protection, and the non-disclosure agreements that every lab technician signs today without a second thought. The impulse that made a medieval alchemist write his nitric acid recipe as a story about a lion eating the sun is the same impulse that makes a modern corporation redact 6 pages of a 10-page filing. The aesthetic changed. The instinct did not. But something was lost in the translation. The alchemist did not separate the study of matter from the study of meaning. To understand how mercury behaved was, for the alchemist, to understand something about the nature of transformation itself, about change, about the relationship between destruction and creation. The philosopher's stone was not just a chemical goal. It was a metaphor for comprehension, the point at which knowledge of the material world and knowledge of the self became the same thing. Modern chemistry kept the techniques and discarded the philosophy. Whether that was wisdom or loss depends on who is asking. Picture the workshop one last time. Dawn light filters through the cracks in the shuttered window. The Athener is cooling, its fire allowed to die for the first time in weeks. The charcoal has gone to ash. The alembic sits empty, still faintly warm, a residue of something pale and crystalline clinging to its glass throat. On the bench, a manuscript lies open to a page showing a red king and a white queen embracing above a furnace. The sulfur smell is fading. The apprentice is gone, promoted or fled or buried, depending on luck and mercury levels. The room is silent in a way it has not been in years. The hidden world did not disappear. It simply took off its costume, washed the soot from its hands, accepted a university appointment, and never spoke of the dragons again. Every single day, roughly 20,000 people line up to photograph the same ruin. They hold gelato. They hold selfie sticks. They hold miniature resin Colosseums purchased from men who materialize out of nowhere the moment a tourist makes eye contact. The light is usually golden because Rome has an unfair arrangement with the sun. And the photos are, almost without exception, gorgeous. None of them capture what used to be written on the building. There was once an inscription on the Colosseum, not tucked away in some basement corridor or scratched into a forgotten wall, but displayed prominently in large bronze letters, bolted to the exterior where absolutely everyone entering could read it. A dedication, a receipt, a brag. In 1995, the German epigraphist Jeza Alfeldi did something quietly extraordinary. He studied the pattern of small holes left behind in the travertine, the pinholes and dowel marks where bronze letters had once been fastened, and from those tiny wounds in the stone, he reconstructed the original text. The inscription, catalogued as CIL 6, 4454, almost certainly declared that Emperor Vespasian ordered the amphitheater built from the spoils of war. The manubiae. The plunder. Not just any war. The Jewish war. The total military destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, the razing of its temple, the enslavement of its population, the liquidation of one of the wealthiest religious institutions in the ancient Mediterranean. That is what paid for the postcard. The most photographed ruin in Western civilization was, from its very first stone, a trophy. It was built with stolen money, raised by stolen hands, and its original inscription made absolutely certain that nobody could pretend otherwise. The emperor wanted credit. He got it for a while. Then the bronze was stripped. The letters vanished. And slowly, century by century, the story underneath was sanded smooth until all that remained was an aesthetic marvel and a line for tickets. So let's sit with this one. Gently. Honestly. Because the stone still has the holes, and the holes still have a story to tell. To understand why the Colosseum exists, it helps to understand that Rome, in the late 60s AD, was broke in the most spectacular way an empire can be broke, violently. Nero had drained the treasury. The Great Fire of 64 had demanded massive rebuilding. Then Nero built himself the Domus Aurea, a private palace complex so grotesquely lavish that it included an artificial lake, a revolving dining room, and enough gold leaf to make the sun feel inadequate. When Nero finally died in 68, he left behind not a government but a power vacuum with debts. What followed was the Year of the Four Emperors, a 12-month stretch of civil war in which Rome burned through Galba, Otho, and Vitellius like matches. Each succession cost money. Each battle cost more. By the time Vespasian, a grizzled general from a decidedly unglamorous family, clawed his way to the throne in 69, Rome's finances were a ruin more total than anything the fire had managed. He needed two things simultaneously: money and legitimacy. He was not from the old aristocracy. He had no dynasty. He had no inherited right to rule. What he did have was a war. The First Jewish-Roman War had been grinding on since 66, when Jewish rebels in Judea revolted against Roman taxation and governance. Vespasian had been personally commanding the campaign before his elevation to emperor. His son, Titus, took over the siege of Jerusalem. And Jerusalem, it must be said, was not just any city. It was a city with a temple. The Temple of Jerusalem was one of the wealthiest single institutions in the ancient world. It collected tithes from Jewish communities across the Mediterranean. It held donations from kings and foreign dignitaries. Its inner chambers contained gold fixtures, gold walls, gold everything. The treasury reserves alone represented centuries of accumulated devotion, converted into metal and stored in one extraordinarily well-defended location. When Titus breached the walls in the summer of 70 AD, the destruction that followed was not incidental. It was the point. The historian Josephus, himself a Jewish defector serving Rome, recorded the aftermath with a specificity that reads less like narrative and more like an audit. So much gold was seized from Jerusalem and flooded into the markets of Roman Syria that the regional price of gold dropped by half. Half. A single military campaign crashed a commodity market across an entire province. That is not a war story. That is a financial event with a body count. And then there were the people. Josephus records approximately 97,000 captives taken during and after the siege. Some were sent to mines. Some were sent to arenas across the eastern provinces to die for entertainment. And a significant number were shipped to Rome, where a very large construction project was about to begin. Vespasian had found his budget. Follow the money. It is an old investigative instinct, and it works on ancient empires just as well as modern ones. Modern scholars have attempted to estimate the total cost of the Colosseum's construction. And while ancient accounting records are predictably not available in spreadsheet format, the range tends to land somewhere in the territory of what today might equal several $100 million. Stone, labor, iron clamps, bronze fittings, the sophisticated drainage and hydraulic systems beneath the arena floor. None of it was cheap. All of it was paid for with the spoils of a single war. The technical term is manubiae, the legally designated plunder that a Roman general could claim from a conquered enemy and dedicate to public works. The Flavians did not merely use the Jewish war spoils. They branded them. The inscription on the Colosseum named the manubiae explicitly. And if the inscription was not enough, there was the Arch of Titus, still standing today at the entrance to the Roman Forum, its interior relief panels depicting a very specific parade. Look closely at those carvings. Roman soldiers carry the sacred objects of the Jerusalem temple through the streets of Rome in triumph. The menorah, the silver trumpets, the table of showbread. These are not abstract symbols of victory. They are specific, identifiable items looted from a specific, identifiable building. They are not trophies. They are receipts carved in marble, showing the exact merchandise that financed the empire's most famous entertainment venue. And the extraction did not stop with the sack. After the war, Vespasian imposed the fiscus Judaicus, a special tax levied on every Jewish person in the empire, regardless of whether they had participated in the revolt or even lived in Judea. 2 drachmas per year, collected with the same bureaucratic efficiency Rome applied to everything. The tax that had once gone to the temple in Jerusalem was now redirected to the temple of Jupiter Capitolinus in Rome. The symbolism was not subtle. It was not meant to be. What makes the Flavian approach unusual is its transparency. Roman emperors generally preferred to obscure the origins of their building projects behind vague references to personal generosity or state funds. The Flavians did the opposite. They wanted everyone to know. The inscription, the arch, the parade, the tax, every element was designed to say the same thing. We destroyed a nation, and here is what we built with the wreckage. The confession was the advertisement. Now for the part that smells. 20 miles east of Rome, in the hills near the town of Tabor, which today goes by the somewhat more manageable name of Tivoli, the quarries sit in pale, chalky silence. The travertine deposits there are ancient, formed by mineral-rich water flowing through limestone over millennia, leaving behind a stone that is creamy, porous, warm to the touch, and almost absurdly photogenic. It is the stone that gives Rome its particular golden glow in the late afternoon. It is also the stone that nearly 100,000 enslaved and conscripted workers spent a decade hauling out of the earth in blocks weighing up to 8 tons each. The numbers are staggering even by Roman standards. Modern estimates suggest the Colosseum required roughly 100,000 cubic meters of travertine. That stone had to be cut from the quarry face with iron tools, wedge by wedge, a process that produced a fine white powder which hung in the air like fog and settled on skin, in hair, in lungs. The dust tasted of chalk and calcium. It dried the throat, coated the teeth, turned sweat into a thin white paste. Workers who spent years in the quarries breathed it in with every inhale, and it settled inside them just as surely as it settled on the ground. The blocks, once freed, were loaded onto ox-drawn carts or wooden sledges and transported along a specially maintained road to Rome. 20 miles. In Italian summer heat. With blocks that required teams of dozens to move and could kill a man instantly if a rope slipped or a wheel cracked. The sound of the quarry was constant. The rhythmic ring of iron striking stone, the creak of wooden cranes, the shouts of overseers, the low groaning of draft animals pulling loads that tested the physics of what wood and rope could bear. And the hands that did this work? A significant portion of them belonged to Jewish captives from the war. Josephus's figure of 97,000 prisoners provides the scale, and while not all of them ended up at the quarries or the construction site, Roman practice consistently directed war captives toward large-scale infrastructure projects. They were not workers. They were inventory. Line items in the same budget that listed the gold and the silver trumpets and the sacred table. Archaeology cannot recover their names. No inscriptions honor them. No graffiti in the quarry walls records a message from someone who was forced to be there. The stone remembers nothing about the people who cut it. It only remembers how to be beautiful. The Colosseum's engineering is, by any honest measure, astonishing. The arched construction, the sophisticated weight distribution, the system of internal corridors and ramps that could move 50,000 spectators in and out with remarkable efficiency. Every documentary mentions this. Every guided tour praises it. And every one of those perfect arches was set in place by hands that did not volunteer for the project. That is the tension at the heart of the building, and it has never really been resolved. The genius of the engineering and the horror of the labor are not separate stories. They are the same story, told from different heights. Here is a detail that deserves to be noticed more than it is. Vespasian did not build the Colosseum on empty land. He built it on Nero's swimming hole. The Domus Aurea, Nero's infamous private palace, had included an enormous artificial lake right in the center of Rome. A private body of water surrounded by private gardens, private colonnades, and a private colossal statue of Nero dressed as the sun god. It was, to put it diplomatically, not a great look for a city where ordinary people lived in cramped, fire-prone apartment blocks and occasionally starved. When Vespasian came to power, he drained the lake. And on the drained lakebed, he began construction of a public amphitheater, open to all Roman citizens, free of charge. The political symbolism was exquisite. Where a tyrant had hoarded pleasure, the Flavians gave it away. Where Nero had built a private paradise, Vespasian built a public spectacle. The message was carved into every design choice. This emperor serves the people. It was a masterful piece of populist architecture. It was also funded by the complete destruction of an ethnic and religious community on the other side of the Mediterranean, but the marketing department chose not to emphasize that angle quite so heavily. When Titus inaugurated the completed amphitheater in 80 AD, the opening games lasted 100 days. Cassius Dio records that roughly 9,000 animals were killed during the festivities. Hundreds of gladiators fought. Naval battles were staged by flooding the arena floor. The spectacle was designed to be so overwhelming, so generous, so undeniably entertaining that the audience would associate the Flavian name with abundance forever. And among those who fought and died on the sand during those 100 days, almost certainly Jewish captives. Roman practice routinely used war prisoners in the arena, both in staged hunts called venationans and in public executions. The captives of the Jewish war had already been sent to arenas across the Eastern Empire in the years following the siege. It would have been unusual, even by Roman standards, not to include them in the grand opening of the very building their enslavement had financed. Think about that for a moment. The people who quarried the stone, who hauled the blocks, who were purchased with the same treasury gold that paid for the iron clamps and the marble seats, some of them likely ended up on the arena floor as part of the show. They built the stage. Then they died on it. Every seat in the Colosseum was a political statement. The seating was arranged by social class, senators at the bottom, commoners at the top, with the emperor's box positioned for maximum visibility. The architecture itself argued that Rome was orderly, generous, and invincible. And the people who had been conquered to make that argument possible were nowhere in the narrative, except briefly, bleeding on the sand for the entertainment of the crowd that sat in the seats their labor had built. The building was not just a venue. It was a thesis. The bronze letters came off first. Nobody recorded exactly when, which is fitting for a story about things being quietly removed. Sometime in late antiquity, possibly during one of the many sackings of Rome that made the 5th century such a lively period in real estate, someone pried the bronze letters from the facade. Not for ideological reasons. Not because the message had become uncomfortable. Because bronze is valuable, and a city being sacked tends to prioritize recyclable metals over historical preservation. What remained were the holes. Small, precise, unremarkable. Pinholes and dowel channels where each letter had been anchored to the stone. For over 1,000 years, nobody thought much about them. The inscription was gone. The building remained. And the story it told shifted with every generation that looked at it. The Flavian dynasty ended in 96 AD with the assassination of Domitian, Vespasian's second son, and a ruler so unpleasant that the Senate voted to erase his memory from public record. The new dynasty, the Nerva Antonines, had no particular interest in advertising the Jewish war. The specific connection between the amphitheater and the sack of Jerusalem became politically irrelevant, then historically obscure, then simply forgotten. Christianity rewrote the next chapter. As the new faith rose to dominance in the Roman Empire, the destruction of the Jewish temple in 70 AD was reinterpreted through theological lenses. It became divine punishment. It became prophecy fulfilled. It became evidence that God had transferred his covenant from the old chosen people to the new. The financial reality that the temple's gold had been melted down and spent on a building where people were fed to lions was far less useful to theologians than the symbolic reading. The money disappeared from the story. The theology filled the gap. By the medieval period, the Colosseum had acquired yet another narrative layer. Christian tradition held that the arena was a site of mass martyrdom, a place where early Christians had been executed for their faith. Whether this was historically accurate on any significant scale is debated, but the belief was powerful enough to consecrate the space. The Colosseum became holy ground. Popes protected it. Pilgrims visited it. The building that had been financed by the destruction of one religious community was now venerated as a shrine to the suffering of another. Then came the Romantics. Poets and painters of the 18th and 19th centuries arrived in Rome and saw in the Colosseum something irresistible, a ruin. Overgrown with wildflowers lit by moonlight, crumbling with picturesque grace. Byron wrote about it. Goethe sketched it. The ruin became sublime, universal, a meditation on the passage of time itself. It belonged to everyone and nowhere. It was architecture stripped of context and rebuilt as atmosphere. Each era found its own elegant method of not reading the plaque. The bronze was gone, and in its absence, every generation projected exactly the story it preferred onto the stone. The pinholes stayed. Nobody asked what they meant. The Arch of Titus still stands. It is right there at the entrance to the Roman Forum, and every visitor to the archaeological site walks past it or under it. The interior relief panels are famous. They depict the triumphal procession of 71 AD, Roman soldiers carrying the spoils of Jerusalem through the streets. The menorah is clearly visible, carried on the shoulders of the victors. So are the silver trumpets. So is the table of showbread. It is, without exaggeration, one of the most explicit depictions of wartime plunder in the entire ancient world, and it is not hidden, locked away, or difficult to access. It is on the standard walking route between the Colosseum and the Palatine Hill. And yet, pick up a typical guidebook. Listen to a standard audio tour. Watch any of the dozens of popular documentaries about the Colosseum produced in the last 30 years. The emphasis falls, almost without exception, on gladiators, on engineering, on crowd management, on the Valerium sunshade system, on the exotic animals brought from the edges of the empire. These are genuine and fascinating aspects of the building. They are also very conveniently the aspects that require no uncomfortable conversations about where the funding came from. The sack of Jerusalem appears in academic sources. It appears in scholarly footnotes. It appears in the kind of dense, peer-reviewed articles that circulate among historians who already know the story. What it does not reliably appear in is the version of the Colosseum that 40 million tourists encounter every year. The information is available. It is simply not emphasized. And the gap between available and emphasized is where sanitization lives. This is not unique to Rome. Beloved civic landmarks around the world carry origin stories that have been filed smooth by time and tourism. Grand public buildings funded by colonial extraction. University halls endowed by profits from enslaved labor. National monuments sited on land taken by force. The pattern is so consistent it almost qualifies as an architectural tradition in its own right. Build something beautiful enough, and eventually the beauty becomes the only story anyone tells. Meanwhile, the Fiscus Judaicus, Vespasian's special tax on Jewish communities throughout the empire, outlasted the Flavian dynasty by centuries. It continued under emperors who had no personal connection to the Jewish war and no political need to reference it. The tax was simply too useful to cancel. It was finally reformed, possibly abolished, sometime in the mid-3rd century, roughly 180 years after the war that inspired it. For nearly 2 centuries, every Jewish family in the Roman Empire paid a recurring fee that had originated as a victory surcharge for the destruction of their holiest site. The Colosseum's construction was finished within a decade. The bill kept coming for generations. So the monument keeps its secret the way most monuments do. Not through concealment, but through emphasis. Emphasize the arches. Emphasize the gladiators. Emphasize the engineering. Let the rest recede into the background noise of history, available to anyone who looks, invisible to anyone who does not. The Arch of Titus stands in plain daylight with its menorah relief facing the foot traffic, and most visitors glance at it the way commuters glance at a billboard. Something to see. Nothing to read. On a summer evening in Rome, when the tour groups have thinned and the light goes from gold to amber to something that feels almost liquid, the travertine of the Colosseum is warm to the touch. Not metaphorically. Literally warm. The stone absorbs the day's heat and holds it, releasing it slowly into the cooling air like a body that has not yet realized it should be cold. Press a hand to the surface and it feels almost alive, almost breathing, almost willing to tell the story if asked properly. The pinholes are still there. Small, round, slightly irregular, scattered across the facade in patterns that only mean something if someone has told the story of what used to fill them. Bronze letters. A dedication. A name. A war. A price. Jeza Alfeldi read those holes in 1995 the way a doctor reads a scar, tracing the shape of something that was once present and is now defined entirely by its absence. The letters said what the building cost. Not in sesterces. In a civilization. There is a temptation, at this point in any story like this, to reach for a grand moral. To demand that plaques be installed, that tour guides be retrained, that the world collectively agree to feel bad about something that happened nearly 2,000 years ago. But that is not quite the point, and the darkly cozy truth is a little quieter than that. History does not ask anyone to stop admiring beautiful things. The Colosseum is, by every measure, an extraordinary achievement. Its arches are still elegant. Its engineering is still astonishing. Its ability to survive 2 millennia of earthquakes, looting, and tourism is nothing short of miraculous. Admiring it is not the problem. The problem is pretending that admiration is the whole story. The people who cut the travertine left no names. The people who hauled it left no memoirs. The people who may have died on the arena floor during the opening games left no last words, at least none that any Roman thought worth recording. What they left is the building itself, which stands because they stood and bled and carried and could not refuse. The Colosseum is not a neutral monument. It is a specific monument to a specific act of destruction, commissioned by a specific emperor who wanted specific credit, built by specific hands that did not choose to be there. Sitting with that discomfort does not diminish the building. It completes it. So the next time the golden light hits just right, and the travertine glows and the whole structure looks like something out of a painting that exists only to make the viewer feel the passage of time, look a little closer. Find the small holes in the stone where the bronze used to be. They are not large. They are not dramatic. They are just empty in the particular way that things are empty when something true has been removed and nothing has been put back in its place. The letters are gone. The holes remain. And the stone, warm and patient, keeps the shape of what was written. There is a moment, universally dreaded and almost never discussed, that happens in the quiet of a bedroom on a terrible morning. Someone has died. The phone call has been made. The tears have started or haven't. depending on the kind of person and the kind of loss. And then, with all the grace of a freight train changing tracks, grief pivots to something absurdly practical. The closet. Somewhere between shock and the first cup of coffee nobody tastes, a person stands in front of their wardrobe and performs one of the oldest rituals in human civilization. They reach for black. Not navy. Not charcoal. Black. The darkest thing available. A dress that smells faintly of the last wedding it attended, or a suit jacket that hasn't seen daylight since a job interview 3 years ago. It doesn't matter if it fits well. It doesn't matter if it's comfortable. What matters with a strange and almost physical urgency is that it is dark enough. Nobody taught this explicitly. There was no funeral fashion orientation on the first day of school. No pamphlet slipped between the tax forms and the voter registration. And yet the knowledge sits in the bones, firm and non-negotiable. Wear black. Wear dark. Do not, under any circumstances that you value your social standing, show up in yellow. Pause on that for a moment. Imagine, just briefly, wearing a bright coral sundress to a burial, a cherry red tie, lime green trousers. The stomach clenches. Not in disagreement, but in something closer to alarm, as if a very old siren just went off in some back room of the nervous system. That reaction is interesting. It has no rational modern basis. Black doesn't help the dead. It doesn't ease the grief. It doesn't perform any function that a deep navy or a muted gray couldn't handle just as well. And yet, the anxiety is real, automatic, and almost universal. The reason, as it turns out, has nothing to do with respect or solemnity or the aesthetic preferences of funeral directors. The reason is much older, much stranger, and far more frightened. Because the original purpose of wearing black to a funeral was not to honor the dead. It was to hide from them. To understand why ancient people dressed the way they did around a corpse, it helps to understand what they believed was happening to the person inside it. And the answer, across a startling number of unrelated cultures, was the same. The dead were confused. Not peacefully ascending. Not serenely departing. Confused. Disoriented. Wandering around in a fog of spiritual jet lag, unsure where they were, unsure why nobody was answering them, and increasingly upset about it. In ancient Mesopotamia, the spirit of the recently dead, the Temu, was believed to linger near the body for days. It could hear. It could feel the warmth of the living moving past. And if it wasn't properly attended to, properly fed with offerings and guided with rituals, it would do what any confused and frightened being does. It would reach for the nearest familiar face. This was not a comforting thought. In pre-Roman Italy, the lemures were restless spirits of the dead who wandered the earth, especially those who had died violently, suddenly, or without proper burial. They could enter homes. They could touch the living. The Roman paterfamilias would rise at midnight during the Lemuria festival, walk barefoot through the house, and throw black beans over his shoulder to appease them, chanting 9 times that the household was free of ghosts. Which is a level of dedication to home security that modern alarm companies can only dream of. In parts of sub-Saharan Africa, the ancestor spirits required immediate and careful management after death. A spirit that was not properly mourned could become angry, possessive, or parasitic, attaching itself to a living relative and bringing illness, madness, or death. In early Chinese mourning rites, the soul was understood to have multiple components, some of which stayed near the body while others wandered. The wandering parts needed direction. Without it, they became hungry ghosts, lost and grasping. The common thread is not theology. It is fear. Specifically the fear that the dead person does not yet understand that they are dead, and that in their confusion, they will look around for someone they recognize. A spouse, a child, a friend. And then they will follow that person, cling to them, perhaps drag them back across whatever threshold separates the living from the dead. So the vigil by the body was not merely mournful. It was watchful. The air around the corpse felt thick, charged, as if the room had one too many people in it. Mourners avoided meeting the eyes of the dead because eye contact was recognition, and recognition was an invitation. The candles flickered, the incense burned, and somewhere in the shadows of every culture's funeral room, the same desperate logic took hold. If the dead are looking for you, you need to make sure they cannot find you. And so humanity invented the first funeral dress code. Not out of fashion. Not out of decorum. Out of survival. In ancient Greece, mourners preparing for a funeral didn't simply put on dark clothing. They smeared their faces and arms with ash. They tore their garments into shapeless rags. They cut their hair, scratched their skin, and made themselves, by every available measure, unrecognizable. The goal was not to perform sorrow, although sorrow was certainly present. The goal was to become nobody. A blur. A smudge. Something the psyche of the dead, still hovering near the body, would glance past without a flicker of recognition. The color of the garments mattered less than their formlessness. Dark, undyed fabric was preferred because it absorbed the wearer into shadow. No bright edges. No familiar patterns. No embroidery that a ghost might remember from a dinner party or a market stall. The mourner became a shape in the corner of the dead person's fading vision, too dim and too strange to register as someone worth following. Rome refined this instinct without abandoning its logic. The toga pulla, the dark mourning toga, was worn during the formal period of grief, specifically the days when the spirit was believed to still be present and aware. It was undecorated, unbleached, and deliberately stripped of the status markers that Roman clothing usually carried. A senator in a toga pulla looked like anyone. That was the point. Ghosts, like everyone else in Rome, navigated by status. Remove the status, and the ghost lost the trail. The same principle surfaced thousands of miles away in cultures that had never heard of Rome. In parts of West Africa, mourners painted themselves with white clay or smeared charcoal across their bodies, transforming into something the spirit would not recognize. In parts of Melanesia, mourners wore masks during funeral rites, full coverings that hid face and form entirely. The material varied. Clay, ash, bark cloth, charcoal. The color varied too, sometimes white, sometimes black, sometimes the dull brown of river mud. But the logic was always identical. Disguise yourself. The dead are watching. Veils, so often interpreted through the lens of feminine modesty or Victorian propriety, originally served this same function. A face behind a veil is a face the ghost cannot read. A body draped in dark, shapeless cloth is a body the spirit cannot claim. The entire vocabulary of funeral fashion, the hoods, the cloaks, the long trailing garments that erase the human form beneath them, began as a set of instructions for the same desperate task. Become invisible. It is, when considered clearly, one of the most remarkable feats of collective invention in human history. Billions of people, across thousands of years and dozens of independent traditions, all arriving at the same conclusion. When someone dies, hide. Wear the dark. Erase your face. And pray that whatever is left of the person you loved doesn't come looking for you in the night. We invented funeral fashion as a survival mechanism. And the fact that it now has its own section in department stores is, frankly, one of civilization's better jokes. Once the camouflage logic clicks into place, an entire catalog of funeral customs that previously seemed like quaint superstitions suddenly snaps into sharp, unsettling focus. Consider the covered mirror. In Jewish mourning tradition in Victorian English homes, in Irish Catholic households well into the 20th century, mirrors in the House of the Dead were draped with cloth the moment someone died. The explanation usually offered is vague. Respect. Vanity avoidance. A general sense that mirrors and death don't mix. But the original reasoning was far more specific. A mirror was a beacon. It captured reflections, and reflections were dangerously close to souls. A spirit passing a mirror might be trapped in it, might be attracted to it, or, worst of all, might see the reflection of a living person and use that image to follow them. Covering the mirror wasn't superstition. It was closing a window that the dead might look through. Consider the eyes. Nearly every culture that practiced laying out the dead also practiced closing their eyes. Coins on the lids in Greece. Gentle pressure in Christian practice. The ostensible reason was dignity, peace, the appearance of sleep. The older reason was blunter. Open eyes could see. And a spirit still lingering in or near the body might use those eyes to identify the mourner standing over it. Closing the eyes was not kindness. It was defense. Consider the direction of the coffin. In much of Europe, the coffin was carried out of the house feet first, so the dead person's face pointed away from the home. The corpse could not see the door, could not memorize the path back. In parts of Ireland, pallbearers deliberately took winding, confusing routes to the cemetery, doubling back, taking unnecessary turns, creating a trail so tangled that no ghost could retrace it. In parts of Eastern Europe, the threshold of the house was sprinkled with salt or ash after the body passed through, a line the spirit supposedly could not cross. Every single one of these customs, the veil, the hood, the draped mirror, the closed eyes, the feet first exit, the winding procession, operates under one shared assumption. The dead are aware. The dead are watching. And the living need every trick available to avoid being seen, followed, or claimed. It is a comprehensive system, really. Almost admirable in its thoroughness. Humanity looked at death and said, with the quiet determination of someone locking every window before a storm, not today. The ghost was real to them. The danger was real. And the wardrobe, the veil, the darkened mirror were not theater. They were armor. Christianity had a ghost problem. Theologically, the situation was tidy. A person died. The soul went to judgment. Heaven, hell, eventually purgatory for those who needed a middle option. The point was that the soul went somewhere. It did not hang around the living room, peering at mourners and memorizing escape routes. Ghosts, in the official doctrinal sense, were not supposed to exist. The congregants, unfortunately, had not read the doctrine. Across early Christendom, from the Mediterranean to the British Isles, converts arrived at the baptismal font carrying centuries of funeral tradition in their bones. They covered mirrors. They closed the eyes of the dead. They wore dark, shapeless garments and walked winding paths to the grave. They left food offerings for spirits they weren't supposed to believe in and whispered prayers that sounded suspiciously like incantations. The new faith had claimed their Sundays, but death still belonged to the old fears. The church fathers noticed. Augustine of Hippo, writing in the early 5th century, complained about the persistence of excessive mourning customs, the wailing, the ash, the elaborate funeral performances that looked far more pagan than penitent. He urged Christians to mourn with restraint and faith, not with the theatrical desperation of people who feared the dead might be listening. Other theologians echoed him. The dead are with God. Stop behaving as if they are standing behind you. But behavior, especially behavior rooted in fear, does not respond well to theological memos. So the church did what institutions do when they cannot eliminate a custom. It absorbed it. Black mourning garments were rebranded. No longer camouflage, they were now expressions of humility before God, symbols of the somberness of mortal sin, visual reminders that the flesh was temporary and the soul eternal. The veil became modesty. The dark garments became penitence. The ash became Ash Wednesday, tidily relocated from the funeral to the liturgical calendar. The behavior stayed. The explanation changed. And the underlying anxiety, the old animal fear of being seen by the dead, simply went underground, running beneath the surface of Christian mourning like water under pavement. Medieval funeral rites became a fascinating hybrid. The priest prayed for the soul's swift journey to God. The congregation nodded solemnly. And then, almost immediately, everyone went back to carrying the coffin out feet first, draping the mirrors, and refusing to speak the dead person's name after dark. The theology sat on top of the tradition like a formal hat on a very old head. It looked official. Underneath, everything was exactly the same. The church didn't kill the ghost. It just gave the ghost a new costume, which, given the topic, feels almost poetic. And then came the Victorians, who took a primal fear, a theological rebrand, and a social custom and turned them into the most spectacular commercial enterprise death has ever known. The year was 1861. Prince Albert, beloved husband of Queen Victoria, died of typhoid fever at the age of 42. Victoria was devastated. She wore black for the remaining 40 years of her life. She slept beside his nightclothes. She had his rooms preserved exactly as he left them. Hot water brought to his chamber every morning, fresh clothes laid out on his bed. It was grief so total, so consuming, and so public that it reshaped an entire culture's relationship with mourning. What followed was not just fashion. It was an industry. Mourning warehouses sprang up across London, the most famous being Jay's London General Mourning Warehouse on Regent Street, a department store devoted entirely to death. Floor after floor of black crepe, black bombazine, black silk, black wool, black jet jewelry, black bordered stationery, black-edged handkerchiefs. A widow could walk in wearing whatever she had arrived in and walk out fully outfitted for 2 years of grief, assuming she could afford it. Many couldn't. Many went into debt. Some families spent more on mourning clothes than on the funeral itself. The sensory reality of Victorian mourning dress was, to put it gently, punishing. The black crepe that was considered essential for deep mourning was coarse, heavily starched, and treated with a chemical finish that gave it a matte, almost chalky texture. It could not get wet without bleeding black dye onto the skin. It smelled of the chemicals used to fix the color, a sharp, acrid tang that lingered in the fabric for weeks. In summer, black wool and crepe trapped heat against the body like an oven. Women reported drenching their undergarments with sweat, the dye from their dresses staining their skin, the stiff fabric chafing against their necks and wrists until the skin cracked. And this was required. Full mourning for a widow lasted 2 years. 2 years of unrelieved black. Then came half mourning, when muted grays and lavenders were permitted another 6 months to a year. Then quarter mourning with its slightly broader palette. The entire process could consume 3 years or more, during which a woman's wardrobe, social life, and public identity were dictated entirely by her proximity to death. Outside the window, the funeral processions completed the picture. Black horses draped in black velvet, their heads crowned with black ostrich plumes that bobbed with each step. Black carriages with black curtains. Mutes, professional mourners hired to stand silently at the door in full black livery, their faces fixed in expressions of theatrical sorrow. The entire visual field of death was saturated in black, a color that by now had traveled so far from its origins that nobody remembered it had started as a disguise. The ghost had been forgotten entirely. What remained was a commercial machine of extraordinary efficiency, converting grief into revenue, social compliance into product lines, and a prehistoric survival instinct into quarterly earnings. Somewhere beneath the creep and the commerce, the original logic lay buried. Invisible. Just like it was always meant to be. The burden, it should be noted, was not distributed equally. When a man lost his wife in Victorian England, he wore a black armband. He attended the funeral. He observed a period of social restraint lasting, at most, a few months. Then he returned to his club, his business, his social calendar, and, if he wished, the search for a new wife. The armband came off. Life resumed. When a woman lost her husband, she disappeared. For 2 full years, a Victorian widow was expected to wear heavy black, cover her face with a crepe veil, and withdraw almost entirely from social life. She could not attend parties, dances, or the theater. She could not wear jewelry that wasn't made of jet or dark stone. She could not laugh too loudly in public. Her stationery was edged in thick black borders. Her visiting cards were printed on black paper. She was in every visible way a walking monument to her husband's absence. Her entire public identity collapsed into a single function, proof that someone was dead. The consequences of noncompliance were severe and swift. A widow who emerged from mourning too early was the subject of vicious gossip. Was she not sad enough? Had she wanted him gone? Had there been someone else? The black dress wasn't just fabric. It was a character witness. Remove it too soon and the verdict was guilty. Conversely, a widow who wore mourning too long risked being seen as morbid, attention-seeking, or mentally unwell. The window of acceptable mourning was narrow, socially policed, and almost impossible to navigate without offending someone. The dark irony is almost too perfect. The original mourning garments, the ash and the veils, and the shapeless dark cloth were designed to make women invisible to ghosts. Thousands of years later, the descendants of those garments made women invisible to society. The camouflage worked. Just not on ghosts anymore. The widow vanished into her black creep the way a mourner once vanished into ash, hidden, silenced, and expected to stay that way until the calendar said otherwise. And the cost was not merely social. Working-class families, already strained by the loss of a breadwinner, faced the additional financial burden of an entirely new wardrobe that could only be worn for grief. Second-hand mourning clothes became a booming trade. Charitable organizations distributed black dresses to widows who couldn't afford them, which is the kind of sentence that sounds generous until it settles in the stomach. The ghost was long gone. The prison it built remained, reupholstered in respectability and enforced by neighbors. The thing that finally broke Victorian mourning wasn't philosophy or feminism or a change of heart. It was math. World War I killed nearly 20 million people. In Britain alone, almost 1 million soldiers died. Entire villages lost a generation. If every mother, wife, sister, and daughter had observed full Victorian mourning protocol, the country would have been a nation of women in permanent black, the economy frozen, the social fabric reduced to creep and silence. It was, quite literally, unsustainable. There were not enough black dresses in England. Mourning relaxed. It had to. The rigid timeline softened. The creep industry collapsed. The mourning warehouses closed or pivoted to general fashion. By the middle of the 20th century, formal mourning dress codes had largely evaporated. No one consulted etiquette manuals for the correct hemline of grief. And yet, black at funerals persisted. Persists. Right now, today, in cultures that have long since abandoned every other Victorian convention, the instinct to wear black to a burial remains almost completely intact. There is no law requiring it. No religious mandate in most denominations. No funeral director checking wardrobes at the door. The elaborate rules are gone. The single core behavior survived. More than survived. It thrums with emotional force. Ask anyone to imagine wearing a bright floral dress or a vivid orange shirt to a funeral and watch their face. The reaction is not intellectual disagreement. It is not a calm assessment of social norms. It is a flinch. A tightness in the chest. A gut-level conviction that something terrible will happen, even though no one can articulate what that something might be. This is what a fossilized fear looks like. Not a belief. Not a thought. A reflex. baked so deeply into social instinct that it operates below the threshold of conscious reasoning, firing signals that feel moral and urgent and absolutely non-negotiable. The ghost has been gone for centuries. The camouflage is still on. And every time someone stands in front of a closet on the morning of a funeral, reaching past the blues and the grays for the blackest thing they own, they are completing a ritual that began when someone thousands of years ago smeared ash on their face and prayed the dead wouldn't follow them home. Here, then, is the full arc of a single human behavior traced from its origin to this morning. Someone dies. The people who love them are terrified, not only of the loss, but of the lost, because in the oldest and most honest parts of the human imagination, the dead do not leave cleanly. They linger. They wander. They look for familiar faces in rooms that have grown cold. And so the living do what the living have always done when faced with something they cannot fight and cannot outrun. They hide. They smear ash on their skin. They pull dark cloth over their faces. They burn herbs to mask their scent and walk crooked paths so their footprints can't be followed. They close the eyes of the corpse, cover the mirrors, carry the body out in the direction it cannot see. They build, over centuries and continents, a comprehensive system of supernatural camouflage so thorough that it becomes invisible even to the people performing it. Then religion arrives, and the system gets a new label. Humility. Penitence. Respect for the divine. The fear doesn't disappear. It just learns to speak Latin. Then commerce arrives and the system gets a price tag. Black creep, 12 shillings a yard. Black bombazine, sold by the bolt. Professional mourners, hired by the hour. The fear doesn't disappear. It just learns to turn a profit. Then gender arrives, or rather reasserts itself, and the system becomes a cage. The same dark, shapeless garments that once hid women from ghosts now hide women from society, sealing them inside years of mandatory invisibility while the men around them wear an armband and move on. The fear doesn't disappear. It just finds a new target. And then, eventually, the rules collapse. The industry folds. The theology softens. The mourning timelines dissolve. Everything is stripped away except one stubborn, unkillable instinct. Wear black. Wear dark. Do not be seen. The ghost is gone. It has been gone for a very long time. But the wardrobe remembers. The hands remember. The stomach, clenching at the thought of a red dress at a graveside, remembers. Somewhere in the architecture of social instinct, in the deep basement where feelings live before they become thoughts, the old program is still running. Hide. Be dark. Be shapeless. Be no one the dead would recognize. The next time someone stands in front of a closet on the worst kind of morning, reaching for black with hands that don't hesitate, they might wonder, just for a moment, why it feels so urgent. Why the choice feels less like fashion and more like necessity. Why the color matters so much when nothing about it can possibly matter at all. The answer is in the closet. It has always been in the closet, hanging quietly between the winter coat and the blazer, patient, dark, and older than any language spoken on earth. The ghost moved on. The camouflage didn't. And some part of us, it seems, is still not entirely sure it's safe to take it off.